Should you read Ammianus Marcellinus, an ancient Roman historian living in the 4th century CE? Greek, technically, though. He wasn't Roman like from Rome or from Italy or anything like that. A native Greek, spoken Greek, but he wrote in Latin. And he lived in the Roman Empire, so he's Roman. So, before I get to the review, and this is a review, quick little bio about, this is not him, this is Constantine, but quick little bio about our friend Ammianus Marcellinus. Born in Antioch, again, like I said, native Greek, but he wrote in Latin. He was a huge fan of the Latin language. Not really 100% sure why, and I'm not just me, but historians, classicists, I guess archaeologists are not sure why he liked Latin so much. Not 100% sure, I should say. We have a couple of good guesses. I'm not going to get too bogged down in that discussion because it's not pertinent to my review. This book is a historical account from the end of Nerva's reign. Emperor Nerva ruled in the 1st century CE, all the way until the year 378, which is important in Roman history because that was the Battle of Adrianople, a huge event in Roman history, bigger than I think even our friend Ammianus here thought at the time, because he, unlike most Roman historians, most famous Roman historians, I should say, was a bit of a contemporary of the events that he writes about. And in fact, he takes part in many of the events he writes about. He is physically there, in fighting in many of the battles he writes about, many of the campaigns he's on. He knew many of the emperors and important figures that he talks about in this work. Now, the only other biographical thing I will say about Ammianus Marcellinus is that there's a bit of mix-up about what he called this work. This is his only work. He called it, we think he called it anyway, because it's been known to posterity as the Res Gestae, which is Latin for things done. It's a very simple title for a work that covers hundreds of years, although I should mention that the first 13, and then about like a third of the 14th book are lost to us. There are 31 books in total, first 13 are gone. So the stuff we have left covers from 354 to 378, which is a little unbalanced because that would mean the first 13 books covers like hundreds of years of Roman history. But it's entirely possible that those were just him summarizing those hundreds of years to get to like the good bits, the bits that he, again, took part in or remembers very, very well since he lived them. So it makes sense that he would write about them more, but I'm not going to get into that yet. Stuff like that yet. So it was passed down, the name passed down to us was Res Gestae. However, a lot of translators like to put in their own names for this work. One of them is the later Roman Empire, which our friends at Penguin have called it. I hate this title because there's no way that Ammianus would know that it was the later Roman Empire. He died about 80 years before Rome fell. And he obviously wouldn't have known that Rome was going to end that soon. Not that anyone would admit such a thing anyway. We don't like to admit that the country we live in is doomed to fail. So a little bit of a mix-up. So when I title this review, it's going to say Ammianus Marcellinus, even though that's the author's name, there really isn't a solid title for this work. So keep that in mind. I'm not going to say, a title name when referring to this work. I'm just going to say Marcellinus writes this, or, Marcellinus says blah, 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 blah. So on to the review. This book is great. This book is a classic. So classic, in fact, that Loeb saw fit to include it in their catalog. Now, for those of you who don't know, Loeb Classical Library is a kind of collection of the greatest, most important, insert superlative here, whatever you want to say, of the ancient Roman and Greek, but in this case Roman, works. Historical works, works of theater, if we're talking about the Greek especially, poetry especially, speeches, essays, you name it. If it's major work from that time period, Loeb has it. And Loeb has made it a priority to include Marcellinus in 3 volumes, no less, because this is a very long work, despite what the Penguin edition may lead you to believe, which I will discuss in more detail later. This book is great. The way he writes, and this is all through a translator, mind you, but in terms of the events he covers and the amount of detail he gives, that's something that comes through the translator. One day, when I'm fluent in Latin, because I am a classics student, I will read this again and I can give you an update on the actual diction and cadence and style especially. I know for a fact that he does switch styles, which I may talk about later. I don't know. If it's pertinent to the review, I'll add it. Whatever. Stuff like that, like the minutiae of the language. But that's not going to be for several years because, again, I am just a student. But the events he covers and the way he depicts them are vivid. You really feel, and this is going to sound so generic because a lot of historians, one of the most common, compliments you can give a historical work is oh, you feel like you're there, or you feel like you took part in the event or something like that. But that applies here. And that's where him being present for many of these events really is a benefit to this work, because for half of this book, he uses I, or we. He uses those first person pronouns. I, we did this, we marched here, because he was there. A huge chunk of this book is the account of Julian's campaigns in the Middle East. Emperor Julian, who Ammianus loves, by the way. He loves Emperor Julian, so much in fact that he disparages the other emperors in this book, which we will talk about later. He's there on campaign when, the campaign is off to a great start, and then it inevitably falls apart. Julian dies. History does history stuff. History does its thing, if you will. And so he's able to give these this happened. The biggest strength of this book, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is that there's no guesswork. When you read Tacitus is writing about stuff. I mean, the most recent thing he ever wrote was an account of his father-in-law's campaigns in Britain, which were still, you're talking about a couple decades disconnect, or maybe, maybe a little bit less than that, but you're talking about a lot of years disconnect. Ammianus finished this work in 380, in that range, so all these are fresh in his mind, and he's able to give us these insane amount of details about the events in this work. And even if he's not present for a lot of these, like events in the western part of the empire, for example, he wasn't there, but he definitely heard about what happened, you know, the way news travels and stuff like that. He's getting like the official account of these things, and he remembers them. A really famous scene in this book is the Battle of Strasbourg, which if you guys saw my previous video on this channel, you know that he really does not hold back when it comes to describing the actual like fighting, the hand-to-hand, like front lines fighting of the battle. He really does not spare any detail, no matter how morbid it gets, no matter how violent. He doesn't hold back, which is another great strength of this work. He just does not hold back at all about describing things or giving his opinion, especially. Which is unusual, because you would think a contemporary writer would kind of sweeten certain things, especially when he talks about the conduct of certain emperors and stuff like that. Now, granted, a lot of the emperors he criticizes in this work are dead for various reasons: war, assassination, you know, ancient Roman stuff, pretty much. But still, it's just something that's not done. It's even because you'll find like historians like Tacitus, or maybe, you know, if you want to say Suetonius too, although he gives himself a little bit more leeway. But they hesitate to kind of criticize emperors from the past a lot of times, unless they're like persona non grata figures like Caligula or whatever. Marcellinus has no such hesitations about disparaging emperors. So, which kind of leads me to my third point, is that there really isn't a strong bias in this work. There is some. After all, he is a Roman, so there's, you know, going to be a huge Roman feeling about certain events, especially if we're talking about Rome versus the others, the barbarians, the Persians, the Huns that show up in like the last 20 pages of the book, and you know, the Huns and the Alans and stuff like that. Definitely pro-Roman when it comes to that. But in terms of like inter-Roman Empire kind of you know, differences, like the whole pagan versus Christian thing. Marcellinus was a pagan himself, but he shows no bias, at least not in his writing. He shows no bias against the Christians or for the pagans. Now, he does kind of show an ignorance of how the church operates, because he just doesn't know. He'll like misdescribe. He'll like poorly describe church councils and how they operate, and like the terms he uses and stuff like that. But for the most part, no major biases against a particular group of people within the empire. Nothing major anyway. Nothing worthy of note. It's, you know, it's a long work. I'm sure you can find like one thing, or, you know, one thing you can point to and be like, Jacob, you're wrong. This thing, he said that blah 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 group was the worst people ever. Whatever. Don't do that. Please don't do that to me. Anyways, so yes, he really lives up to the moniker of being a great Roman historian. Now, there are a few downsides to his writing, which I will get into. Nothing too major, like I already said, like I already gave away within the first couple minutes of this review. He's great. I think this book is great. But like I said, number one is that he is biased not against groups. Like I said, he's not biased against a particular group of people, but he'll show his bias against certain leaders, particularly emperors. As I mentioned earlier, Marcellinus loved Julian. Now, we don't 100% know why, but we have a couple of very good guesses, and one of the major ones is that Julian was like, you really get the feeling that Julian and Marcellinus kind of thought the same things about a lot of issues, I guess you could say, or they held a lot of the same opinions. Julian was also a pagan, and Marcellinus, as I already said, is a pagan, so that could be a huge connection for them, especially when you're talking about an empire that's swinging more and more and more towards the Christian demographic than the pagan demographic. Now, that does not mean to say, going back to the larger point here about Julian, Ammianus does criticize Julian about certain things. Julian is really treats the Christians in his empire poorly, except, doesn't persecute them like Nero or Diocletian or anyone like that. There is no killings that goes on under Julian, but he does really make it hard living for the Christians in the empire. Makes it impossible for them to access certain titles and roles within the bureaucracy itself, which obviously prevents them from exerting any kind of influence or anything like that. Just stuff like that. And Ammianus calls him out on this. He says that's wrong. Not that he's calling him out while he's alive, because Julian died in war. But for the most part, he loves Julian. Julian is like his guy. He's like his homie. He is his homie, to use a kind of a colloquial term. So yes, very pro-Julian, very biased for Julian, against non-Julian emperors, especially the emperors that reigned just after and just before Julian. Constantius II is one such emperor. He is the emperor who reigns before Julian, and Ammianus Marcellinus, that is, does not spare any kind of detail about how Constantius is a horrible ruler and how he was cruel and he persecuted these officials who did nothing wrong, blah, blah, blah. And then the rulers after Julian, you have Jovian, who did nothing. He ruled for a couple months after Julian because, read the book if you want to find out. I'm not going to tell you. My review, my rules. But then you have Valentinian, who Marcellinus talks about how Valentinian is like this cruel person who has a really short temper and all this stuff, and Valentinian's brother, who he elevates to the purple to kind of help him rule the empire, same kind of thing. He really does not depict these emperors in a good light, when most historians, most classicists kind of are of the opinion that they really aren't as bad as Marcellinus depicts them, and Marcellinus is just a Julian fanboy. So that's one area where he really shows his bias, and it's really a major part of the work too. It's not just like that's one part of the work when and it may cover like a bunch of other stuff. It's a major part. It's a major almost like the main part of the book in certain areas. Certainly a central narrative, if you will. Now, the other point of criticism I have doesn't have anything to do with Marcellinus. It has to do with the copy I read. Now, I mentioned earlier that the Penguin Classics edition does not make it seem like it's very long, and that's because they they cut content. They cut content from this book. Um, they cut content that they felt that the translator and the editor felt were not important to the main narrative. Um, I don't understand why they did this. Well, no, that's not true. I understand why they did it, and I disagree. Um, you know, you don't read these books for the story. You read them for the events that they talk about, but not in the sense that you don't read this book because you want to know like the broad strokes, like the main story of this time frame. You want to know like all the details, like what was the world like at this time. Now the things they cut have to do more with his explanations for phenomena, for example. Um, a passage about comets, a passage about the nature of earthquakes or how pearls are formed. You know, nothing that seems important on the surface, and so it would make sense on the surface to cut these parts. But those are the fun parts of a work like this. To use an example, many readers of Herodotus will cherish the stories he tells about like the craziest stuff when he describes like a foreign land, like a non-Greek land. Like for example, in Persia, he talks about like there's a certain area where there's these giant gold digging ants that live in the Persian desert somewhere, and it's like stuff like that. It's just so wonderful, and really is what makes these books so fun to read. And they cut that stuff out of this though. Um, so that was a little disappointing. Other than that, it's a fine translation. It gets the job done, and it did not stop me from enjoying the book. But just because I enjoy the book doesn't mean you will. Um, I would not recommend this book to most people. Um, and the reason for that is because it is really a niche. It's really a niche kind of topic, a niche type of book. The only way you will enjoy this book is if you are super into Roman history. You are like a degenerate, almost like it's your life. Roman history is my life. I'm a classics student, kind of leaning in this direction. Um, Other than that, 99.99% of people are not going to enjoy this book at all. It is way too long. They would think it is boring because they don't care about Roman history. Definitely not to the extent of reading like I mean, it's still a 400-page book. And then if you want to talk about like the non-cut content, I mean, you can really go crazy. And to be fair, it's not like the lobes are like the half Latin part, half English part, so it's not like it literally is this long. But still, like half of this, you're still talking about like ridiculous lengths. If you're not a Roman history guy, don't read this book. Stay far away. Stick to the subjects that you love, whatever those may be. But if you are a Roman history guy, if you are a classics student or a historian, Roman historian, Roman historian student, or you're just super, super, super interested in the subject matter, this is a must read. Um, you may not find it on a lot of must-read Roman history lists because they tend to favor like the early empire and the late republic, the quote-unquote good stuff, even though it's all good. I mean, you can't go wrong with Roman history, in my opinion anyway. I am biased. But, yeah, that's all I have to say about it. Classic book that I would not recommend to anyone except for like 0.01% of people. Um, Anyways, if any of you out there have read this book or are thinking about reading this book or whatever, What did you think of it? Do you agree with me? You should, because I'm right. I am right. I am right. But do you agree with me? Explain why, or if you don't agree with me, explain why you're wrong. In the comments below, like the video. If you made it this far, I'm assuming you like the video, although I may do a timestamp because I do kind of meander a little bit. Doesn't matter. Timestamp to like the verdict, I guess. Other than that, I am going to say goodbye. I'll see you in the next review. Goodbye.